What if I told you that the two names Western intelligence agencies monitor most closely are now moving on a collision course that could reshape an entire continent? On one side stands Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the educated heir of a revolutionary legacy that NATO bombs tried to erase forever. On the other side stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young military leader who has become the living symbol of Africa's refusal to kneel. Two different nations, two different struggles, but one undeniable destiny, pulling them together like gravity itself. From Niamey to Bamako, from the ruins of Tripoli to the rising capital of Ouagadougou, a new conversation is spreading through encrypted channels, military barracks, and university halls across the Sahel. Separately, these two men represent profound disruptions to a global order built on African dependence. But together, they could trigger a continental shift that hasn't been possible since the liberation movements of the 1960 seconds. Every decision they make sends ripples through the intelligence communities of Paris, Washington, and Brussels. What if Libya's untapped petroleum wealth and the Sahel's newly awakened military sovereignty merged into a single coordinated front, one powerful enough to challenge 6 decades of systematic foreign control? What if the Pan-African vision that got Muammar Gaddafi killed isn't buried in history, but is quietly being reassembled by the very son who survived the fall? Tonight, we're diving into a story that mainstream media refuses to connect. A story where the dots form a picture too dangerous for the old powers to acknowledge. Because if Saif Gaddafi and Ibrahim Traoré align their strategic interests, the Sahel might transform from a perpetual conflict zone into the command center of a new African order. Stay with us, because what you're about to discover could redefine how Africa negotiates with the world for the next 50 years. They emerged from completely different worlds, shaped by opposite forces. Yet today, their paths are bending toward each other like rivers flowing to the same ocean. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi was born into the epicenter of African power politics. He grew up watching his father fund liberation movements from South Africa to Palestine, challenge the International Monetary Fund, and push relentlessly for a United States of Africa that would negotiate as one bloc. He learned young that true independence carries a price tag written in blood, and that leaders who demand genuine sovereignty become targets for regime change. He saw the Green Book become a blueprint that terrified Western economists. He witnessed African leaders gather in Tripoli to discuss a continental currency backed by Libyan gold reserves. He watched his father stand at the United Nations and tear apart the global power structure with words that still echo today. And then he watched it all collapse when NATO intervention turned Libya from Africa's wealthiest nation into a fractured battleground of competing militias. Captain Ibrahim Traoré learned the same brutal lessons, but his classroom was the battlefield itself. His rise in Burkina Faso shattered the invisible chains that had linked Ouagadougou to Paris for over 60 years. He became the voice of a generation that watched their parents bow to foreign pressure while their nations remained poor despite sitting on mountains of gold and uranium. He speaks the language that young Africans across the continent have been waiting to hear, the language of courage, sovereignty, and sacrifice for a future that belongs to Africans alone. Two radically different journeys, yet one identical adversary waiting at every turn. Across the continent, from Cape Town to Cairo, young people are asking the same forbidden question. What would happen if Libya's massive energy reserves, strategic Mediterranean ports, and symbolic revolutionary heritage aligned with the Sahel's new generation of military leaders who refuse to accept foreign military bases on their soil? Western policy analysts lose sleep over this exact scenario, because the combination of Saif's inheritance and Traoré's revolutionary momentum creates something Africa hasn't possessed in modern history. A unified resistance bloc with both the economic resources and the political will to say no to conditional aid, exploitative mining contracts, and permanent military presence disguised as partnership. And the signs are already appearing for those paying attention. Diplomatic cables report unusual back-channel communications between Sahel envoys and Libyan tribal councils. Intelligence briefings warn of coordinated anti-French sentiment spreading like wildfire across the Sahel belt. Online networks connected to the old Jamahiriya Green movement have begun celebrating Traoré's speeches with the same fervor they once reserved for Gaddafi Sr. The winds are shifting direction, and everyone can feel it. But this is merely the opening movement of a symphony that could change everything, because the moment Gaddafi's son and Traoré synchronize their long-term visions, the entire architecture of neo-colonial influence begins to crack. And that moment isn't coming, it's already here. Before we go deeper into what's unfolding, make sure you smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this African transformation that's happening in real time. Because the next part of this story is going to shake everything you thought you knew about the balance of power. While Libya struggles to rebuild from the ashes of foreign intervention that destroyed Africa's highest standard of living, the Sahel region is experiencing its own tectonic political shift. A new generation of leaders has seized power, leaders who don't flinch at sanctions, who don't back down from threats, and who refuse to accept that African resources must be controlled by non-African corporations. And standing at the absolute center of that revolutionary storm is Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. In less than 2 years, Traoré has transformed from a military officer into something far more significant. He's become a symbol, a rallying point for millions of Africans who are hungry for dignity, sovereignty, and a future not dictated from the conference rooms of Paris, the policy papers of Washington, or the financial institutions of Brussels. Under his leadership, Burkina Faso expelled French military forces that had operated on Burkinabe soil for decades. He reclaimed control of gold mining operations that had been funneling wealth offshore while his people remained among the poorest on earth. He declared loudly that Burkina Faso's allegiance belongs not to foreign powers offering conditional aid, but to the Burkinabe people who deserve to control their own destiny. That single decision created a domino effect that nobody in Western capitals anticipated. In neighboring Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta followed the exact same path, ending French military cooperation and demanding true partnership instead of paternalism. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani broke decades-old defense agreements and ordered foreign military bases closed. In Guinea, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya maintained the momentum, calling for authentic African unity based on mutual respect rather than dependency. 4 sovereign nations, one unified front rising, one unprecedented chapter in the long struggle for African self-determination. But every revolutionary movement faces the same challenge. Passion and courage can inspire populations, but movements require foundations built on economic power to survive. And this is precisely where Libya re-enters the equation with devastating potential. Because while the Sahel Alliance builds its military coordination and political solidarity, it lacks the one critical pillar that transforms resistance into permanence: economic independence. Gold exports and cotton production can only carry a movement so far before it hits the ceiling of what agricultural economies can achieve. But oil changes every calculation on the board. Oil funds standing armies, builds infrastructure that doesn't depend on World Bank loans, and creates the financial shield necessary for a unified African bloc to negotiate from strength rather than desperation. And Libya holds the largest proven oil reserves on the entire African continent, larger than Nigeria, larger than Angola, an ocean of petroleum wealth that could power an entire region's transformation. Traoré's revolution burns with the fire of moral conviction and popular support. Saif Gaddafi controls access to the fuel that could keep that fire burning for generations. And now, for the first time since Muammar Gaddafi's death fractured the Pan-African dream, the political winds of the Sahel are blowing directly toward Tripoli again. Hold on tight, because what comes next has the potential to reshape the global balance of power in ways most people cannot even imagine yet. While Western think tanks scramble to comprehend Traoré's rapid rise and what it represents, very few seem willing to acknowledge the real equation taking shape across the African landscape. An equation older than the artificial borders drawn by colonial administrators who carved up a continent without asking a single African where the lines should go. For the first time in decades, African leaders are openly rejecting foreign military control, and they're doing it with confidence. Not through diplomatic negotiations or polite requests, but through unapologetic assertions of sovereignty that cannot be misunderstood. In Mali and Niger, Military-led transitions have already shattered the old chain linking the Élysée Palace to the Sahel capitals. In Burkina Faso, Traoré tightened that break even further by cutting diplomatic ties, expelling foreign troops, seizing direct control of gold mining operations, and restoring a sense of national pride that many believed had been permanently extinguished by decades of managed dependency. But Libya represents the missing variable that makes the entire equation solvable. Because unlike the Sahelian states fighting their battles with limited resources and landlocked geography, Libya possesses oil reserves that European nations desperately need, natural gas pipelines that could redirect energy flows, strategic Mediterranean ports that control access to an entire region, gold reserves still largely untapped, and most importantly, a name that carries symbolic weight across the entire continent and beyond. Imagine this scenario playing out over the next 5 years. A Sahel confederation with revolutionary determination, youth support, and military coordination, combined with a stabilized Libya under nationalist leadership offering resources, diplomatic leverage, and a historical legacy powerful enough to unite fractured tribal networks once again. This is the precise equation that keeps strategic planners awake in every Western capital, not because it threatens violence, but because it's actually achievable. And even though Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and Ibrahim Traoré have not yet stood side by side at a public summit, their core messages are already synchronized in ways that cannot be coincidental. Africa must control African resources without apology or permission. Foreign military presence on African soil must end permanently. A new continental order must emerge, one that answers only to African populations and African interests. Across the Sahel region, university students and young activists chant the same revolutionary slogans that Muammar Gaddafi shouted from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. Across Libya, tribal leaders frustrated with endless chaos and foreign interference now look south toward the Sahel for inspiration and potential alliance. And across the intelligence agencies of Western nations, classified briefings quietly warn that a coordinated Pan-African realignment could destabilize decades of carefully managed influence and resource extraction. But destabilize for whom exactly? Strengthen for whom? These are the questions that cannot be controlled through the usual mechanisms of pressure and persuasion. And the turning point that Western policymakers hope Africa never reaches is approaching faster than anyone publicly admits. What comes next will test every remaining pillar of foreign influence across the Sahel and North Africa. So don't look away now, because the next movement in this unfolding story is where everything begins to accelerate beyond the point of easy reversal. If there's one factor that made Western powers maintain their grip on the Sahel for over a century, it wasn't ideology or culture or language. It was resources, pure and simple. From gold deposits to uranium mines, from oil fields to rare earth minerals essential for modern technology, the Sahel sits on a treasure chest that has been systematically extracted under the protection of foreign troops, foreign drafted agreements, and foreign-backed governments that prioritized external interests over their own populations. For generations, this system functioned smoothly because the key players all understood their roles. African leaders provided access, foreign corporations extracted wealth, and the populations received just enough aid and development to prevent total collapse. But suddenly, without warning, the ground shifted beneath everyone's feet. One by one, like dominoes designed by history itself, Sahel nations began slamming shut the doors that had always remained open. Burkina Faso expelled French forces that had operated with impunity for decades. Mali ended military cooperation agreements with Western powers. Niger ripped up defense pacts that had stood since independence. And now, imagine this scenario becoming reality. Libya, one of Africa's petroleum giants, with reserves that could power Europe, quietly aligning with that same wave of resistance and self-determination. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi brings something the Sahel desperately needs to consolidate its gains. Oil wealth that doesn't require World Bank approval, Mediterranean ports that bypass traditional trade routes, direct access to European energy markets, and leverage over the same powers that have dictated terms for generations. And Traoré brings something Libya has lacked since the 2011 intervention shattered its stability: A regional alliance bold enough to stand its ground against international pressure, a generation of leaders who've already proven they won't back down, and a model of sovereignty that inspires populations rather than relying on fear. Together, they create a balance that Western strategic planning has spent 60 years trying to prevent from ever forming. Because if Sahel nations gain direct access to Libyan ports and energy infrastructure, they no longer need the trade routes controlled by their former colonial administrators. If Libya's oil wealth begins circulating through regional African channels instead of flowing directly offshore to European refineries, the entire energy dependency equation reverses. If gold, uranium, and petroleum start moving through African-controlled networks with African-determined pricing, the system of managed extraction collapses overnight. This isn't theoretical speculation or wishful thinking by Pan-African idealists. This is the blueprint that policy analysts are quietly calling the economic earthquake, the kind of structural shift where Africa stops exporting raw materials for minimal returns and starts controlling the full value chain of its own natural wealth. But this scale of transformation never arrives without fierce resistance. Western governments and multinational corporations have survived for generations by ensuring that African nations never coordinate at this level of unity and shared purpose. And the exact moment that Libya and the Sahel alliance begin speaking with one unified voice, the silent war to fracture that unity will intensify beyond anything we've seen before. Hold on. Because what happens in the next phase could shake not just the African continent, but the entire global order that's been in place since World War II ended. Something extraordinary is happening across Africa right now, something that future historians will describe as the great realignment of the early 21st century. For over 60 years, Africa's trajectory was determined in foreign capitals far from the continent itself. Paris decided policy directions. Washington confirmed them. The International Monetary Fund approved the loans that came with conditions designed to maintain the system. But today, the winds are changing direction. From Niamey to Bamako, from Ouagadougou to Tripoli, African nations are no longer asking permission or waiting for approval. They're choosing allies based on survival, sovereignty, and mutual respect rather than donor relationships and conditional partnerships. And whether Western media acknowledges it or not, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi and Captain Ibrahim Traoré have become the living faces of this continental transformation. Gaddafi represents the memory of what a powerful, independent Africa looked like before intervention tore it apart. Traoré represents the awakening of a new generation that refuses to repeat the mistakes of the past. And for the first time in modern history, North Africa's resource wealth and the Sahel's military determination are moving in parallel trajectories. Not through signed treaties or public announcements, but through shared resistance, shared belief that Africa must control its own resources, define its own security architecture, and write its own story without foreign editors. Across universities in Accra, youth forums in Nairobi, and military academies in Addis Ababa, one question spreads like wildfire through group chats and late-night discussions. What would Africa actually look like if its leaders finally united behind sovereignty instead of competing for foreign favor? This isn't fantasy anymore. It's becoming operational strategy. Because the moment Libya stabilizes under nationalist leadership and the Sahel secures its borders under governments that refuse foreign military dominance, the map of African power changes permanently. And Western strategists understand this completely. Because once these nations align politically, economically, or militarily in any meaningful way, the old system of managed dependency becomes unsustainable. But here's the part that nobody saw coming. The African shift isn't approaching anymore. It's already in motion, accelerating, every single day. The only question that remains is how far these leaders are willing to push and how much they're prepared to sacrifice to see it through to completion. The Sahel is shifting beneath our feet. The world looks at the Sahel and sees instability, conflict, and crisis requiring intervention. But millions across Africa see something entirely different emerging from the dust. A Libya reclaiming its revolutionary pride, a Sahel reclaiming sovereignty stolen generations ago, and two leaders born from completely different storms now walking toward the same inevitable horizon. Saif al-Islam Gaddafi carries the weight of a legacy that NATO bombing campaigns failed to bury.
Ibrahim Traoré carries the fire of a generation that has decided they will not bow, not to sanctions, not to threats, not to the same powers that kept their grandparents poor. Individually, they each disrupt the balance of power that has controlled Africa for over a century. Together, they represent something far more dangerous to the old world order. A continent awakening to its own potential. Western analysts call it instability and chaos requiring management. But Africans know it by another name that cannot be spoken in polite diplomatic circles: rebirth. A slow, unstoppable shift toward unity, dignity, and self-determination that no amount of foreign pressure can reverse once it reaches critical mass. What comes next? A formal partnership announcement? A new economic corridor linking the Sahel to Mediterranean trade? A security alliance stretching from Libya's coast to Burkina Faso's borders? Or something even larger, a continental front strong enough to rewrite the African story in terms Africans themselves choose? Nobody can predict with certainty. But one truth is absolutely clear to anyone paying attention. The old order is cracking in ways that cannot be repaired with the usual tools of influence and pressure. And the new order is rising from the dust of systems that no longer serve the people they were meant to control. Tell us in the comments right now. Is this the beginning of Africa's long-awaited transformation, or just the storm before the real breakthrough arrives? Whatever your answer, one undeniable truth remains. This is only the beginning, and what comes next will determine Africa's trajectory for the next 50 years. If you want to follow this unfolding African shift as it happens, make sure you subscribe, smash that like button, and turn on all notifications. Because the next chapter of Africa's awakening is already being written, and you'll see it first right here on Traoré Brief Channel.